Hi, I'm Meredith Johnson, a curator at Creative Time. And Creative Time and Art Basel Miami Beach have partnered again this year on the Oceanfront programming. That's at the Oceanfront area between 24th and 21st at Collins. And just to give you a kind of a quick background on the Oceanfront program, the site is designed this year by Fu Wong Office and Raquel Rodham's studio. The site's really amazing. It transforms at night. From 6 to midnight every night, starting last night through Saturday night, we have a program focusing on 4 cities. The first city was last night, which was Detroit, in partnership with MoCAD, Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit. Tonight is Mexico City, in partnership with Museo Tamayo. I actually just came from the sound check, which explains the sandy shoes. So you should all come tonight. The sound check was amazing. Tomorrow night, Friday night, is Berlin with O32C. And Saturday night is Glasgow with Tramway. And so today we decided we were going to do a series of 2 talks about the Oceanfront program, focusing on dialogues with the cities that we're partnering with and our amazing partners. And so today I'm really pleased to introduce Louise Croquer, who's the director and curator of MoCAD in Detroit, and Sarah Munro, who is the director of Tramway in Glasgow. And we sadly are missing Claire Jackson from Tramway because her flight was canceled, but she'll be in later tonight, so you'll see her on the beach on Saturday night.
She'll be dancing.
And we really thought what we would do with this talk is discuss kind of our process in working together to develop the Oceanfront program, because obviously every city has a drastically different environment, a different art community, and what we really wanted to do with the program was look at art practice in each city. And as we were developing this program with our partners, we discovered differences within the cities, but also a lot of similarities and a lot of crossover. And between Detroit and Glasgow, there were quite a range of issues that continued to come up that exist within both cities: conditions, collaborative elements of art practice. And so we were sitting down earlier today talking about this and talking about Glasgow and Detroit, and one of the things that's really present, which is reflected in the programs that have been developed for last night and for Saturday night with Detroit and Glasgow, is really this connection between cross-disciplinary practice and collaboration between the visual art communities and the music communities. Those communities really not being separate, but being one and the same, kind of melding together. And both MoCAD and Tramway have incredibly dynamic music programs in addition to their visual art programs. And so I thought we'd start the discussion with both Louise and Sarah talking a little bit about how their programs are developed at MoCAD and Tramway, and how music and visual art mingle together in those programs. So Louise, I'll start with you.
We actually see our public programs in a non-hierarchical way, so they have equal importance to our visual arts program. And in part, and I think when we were talking earlier, one of the things that we have in common is that we have cities where music is very prevalent and very important, and so in a way it's almost a natural dialogue that occurs with what's around you, and also it's an opportunity for us as institutions to be able to showcase things that are valuable in the community, but that also need to be taken out of that context. On the other hand, I think it creates an interesting dialogue with 2 areas that have been traditionally separated, and many people who follow the bands come and discover the art, and vice versa. And it's I think it's a very important thing. It's something that it's quite a natural progression, but it's a kind of dialogue that I feel that for us has been incredibly important. And yes, it is a program that's incredibly active in that regard, and quite specialized too, because we do feel that our approach to music should be similar to the one that we have with art. So it's a very curated program that tries to showcase what's interesting locally and keeping the finger on the pulse, but also trying to deal with connections internationally as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think that resonates very much around working. When we were putting this program together, I think it's one of the things we talked about earlier was that it's very difficult to, in a way, pigeonhole what a scene is, and certainly to try and represent it in a very particular context that is the Oceanfront. It's a very specific space, it's an outdoor space, and so what we were really wanting to do with the Tramway program was to reflect that sort of, there's a group of artists and artistic activity that was really merging across between music, film and performance practices. And I think certainly within the work that we're showing, it's not about, it was never about, I don't think any of these artists would see themselves as being performance artists, or they really do pull and cross between those. And one of the things that I think has really been interesting in the development of that has been that sense that because these artists are working together very much in a collaborative kind of context, they're very supportive, there's a real social kind of context that helps support the development of that work. And I think what's been interesting watching that over, we've done quite a specific program with this at Tramway over the last sort of year or so, and is looking at the way that different artists kind of ask each other different questions. So those coming from perhaps more of a music background or from the visual arts, in a way, when they work together and they share that support structure across their peer groups, they ask themselves questions in slightly different ways, which then make the artists sort of change or think again about how their work is developing. And we wanted to sort of reflect a sense of some of those artists through this program.
Well, we've talked a lot about how in both Detroit and Glasgow, there really isn't this separation between disciplines, and it's very hard to find a visual artist who isn't somehow connected to the music community, a musician that isn't somehow connected to the visual art community, or that is both, or dating someone in it. It's just the communities are so intertwined with each other. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why that is in the city. What are the conditions in each city that the communities are so close? And we've talked a little bit about it, the architecture, the geography, the history, how that all goes into play in this kind of breakdown of walls between practices.
Yeah, gosh, it's quite a wide question, I'm trying to pin it down a bit. But I think for within Glasgow, certainly a lot of this is that sense that people are sharing a lot of found spaces, and the communities are collaborating, and it's through kind of working together and inviting friends in to other projects. There's an awful lot of kind of very grassroots artist-run projects. The kind of commercial support structures in Glasgow are really very new. You know, 10 years ago there wasn't really a commercial support system in the city at all in terms of visual arts practices. And I think there's always been that history right through from students going to the art college and kind of meeting and having these kind of sharing across that's had quite an influence.
I think it's very similar in Detroit. Perhaps the support structures are very different, but I think the community, if you think of Detroit being a city with great disinvestment and with a population that's decreasing, the artist community is very united and in a very expansive way. So there are all these kinds of collaborations that are generating this kind of horizontal exploration that allows people to draw from the knowledge that other people in other disciplines have. And I think that in that way the work begins to become more hybrid and to draw not only from the personal relationships, but also from the knowledge that there's in the community also, which was, I think, evident last night with the program that we put together, in the sense that very similar to Glasgow, most of the people who were in the program do not work in one specific discipline, but are more engaged in erasing the boundaries or exploring the porous borders of each of the disciplines that they know about, whether it's dance or performance or music. And I think that's where something different begins to emerge, and where we see that there is something that, although not specific, not completely defined is taking shape and mirroring those aspects of society.
Well, and it came up last night in the discussion about Detroit on the Oceanfront. I think Warren from DNG Flash Nation, which is a band that is comprised of visual artists who are also musicians. It came up that really in Detroit, the thing that's become interesting is that spaces have been seized and people have kind of come together to develop projects independent. And this goes back to what you're saying about the commercial structures not necessarily being abundant but there being an abundance of space. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's going on in Detroit now with artists really seizing spaces and starting pop-up alternative spaces and collaborating with not only artists but other disciplines like the food community and all of that.
Right, and I think that it was very eloquent the way that they put it, in the sense that if you have this city that is your studio, essentially, you're able to sort of take over a series of other spaces that normally would not be, where you would normally not be allowed. So, if you are interested in sort of archival issues, you can go into abandoned factories and pick up whatever's on the floor, or you may be able to, rehearse with a band that you're playing in a basement of some other building that's not not inhabited. So there's a kind of freedom and a kind of sense of discovery that really begins to pour into the work. Obviously there are other things that are happening that are also on the borders of art practice, like the urban farming movement, which is very important, and people growing vegetables and things in the shadow of buildings or their houses and communities. And so that kind of crossing of boundaries becomes because sometimes it's the artists themselves who are running the gardens, and that becomes bigger, and obviously as they locate in spaces, people begin to create smaller communities around them that are then, kind of rhizomically begin to grow and to have an impact on the community at large as well.
And which kind of takes it out as well, doesn't it, from being maybe more traditionally there was models where artists would set up their own spaces, but they were still kind of within the artistic community. Right. And I think that's something that's kind of quite interesting about both cities, is that kind of cross and that link between other types of almost like grassroots activities that's happening in other spaces, and that kind of creative kind of influence is much more kind of obvious just now, I think and it's quite exciting.
Yeah.
It's also bewildering for communities. One of the areas where the artists are particularly based in Detroit, where there's quite a lot of movement, is a working class community that used to be Polish town, and that is now a half Bangladeshi, half Polish neighborhood. And you have these artists who are working within the community, doing these kind of projects, using the buildings, using the houses, using the land, and actually interacting with the community at a real level. I mean, they have families and they're living there, so there isn't that separation of the studio. So life and art sort of begin to kind of become one.
Well, we were talking today about how both of your spaces are actually in old transportation depots.
We hadn't realized that, the common link, housing, transport.
Well, and in terms of the Glasgow program too, I mean, I think a lot of people are aware of individual artist practice coming out of Glasgow, but one of the things that's prevalent in the program on Saturday is artists who have individual practices but also have these collaborative practices. So Luke Fowler, who has his own film practice but also collaborates on films with other people, and Martin Creed, he'll be performing with his band. And, I know like Douglas Gordon, his apartment is now an actual exhibition space in Glasgow. Space, and so I was wondering if you could talk about that. My experience with Glasgow is that there's not only very much a collaborative practice of kind of dialogue, but also a cross-generational support of each other.
And I think it's almost that kind of social support that is behind, I think, a huge amount of what's happening and what's developing. And you're very right to say that it isn't just about, so certainly at the moment there's a real evidence of a younger generation who are working in quite deeply collaborative kind of ways. Sorry, face this way, feel like the side of our heads. But you know, it's kind of there is a real energy around that, and a lot of that does link back to using the music as part of that. But again, it is a generational thing that artists will come along and support each other, and it seems to be almost like if there's a single thing that you could, certainly within Scotland, when you're looking at the difference between, say, a city like Edinburgh and Glasgow, it's one of the most obvious ones, I think, is around this. You know, you don't like to separate things out, but there is such a strong peer support structure across the city that influences that, and a quite a deeply collaborative kind of collective sense of artist practices and supporting people to come in and out of different projects.
And I think that the experience of music itself, we were saying, the experience of music and musical towns. Music is such a community experience and a sense of esprit de corps, right? And to infuse artwork with a kind of musical ethos rather than with music, just music itself. But I think that's what sort of, in a way, pouring in this idea of interacting with the audience and having a sense of community and building up. So there's a kind of generosity in these projects and the kinds of things that you were saying, whether it's opening your apartment as an exhibition space or collaborating with other people to make other projects. That sense of community, I think, is sort of articulating that interstitial space in which we're beginning to see, you know, these practices really be rooted in processes that deal with people perceiving the art object.
And that seems to move, you know, when you have artists that are from both of these cities that move away and exist in other visual art communities, like we were talking about Mike Kelly today, and you know, he's very much an LA-based artist, but he's from Detroit, and his practice is infused with this history of sound and music in a way that's very uniquely Detroit. It seems that's true with Glaswegian artists also who've left, that's really prevalent.
Yeah, and keep that link. And again, looking at, we were talking earlier about artists that in a way we did a project recently at Tramway with Yvonne Rayner, and you know, that's an artist who, is she a dancer, is she a filmmaker, is she, you know, and there's a real sense of relevance, I think, for a lot of those younger artists in the city just now, looking back on some of those other artists and who in a sense, it's about the artistic nature of what they do, and they don't define themselves as dancers or musicians or visual artists, and that's really reflected now because of this much more expanded sense of an artist practice.
Yeah, in terms of lineage, I think that's an interesting thing that never, you know, as we begin to see these practices become something, then the lineage seems to be a lineage that's not completely linear, but rather a series of lines that connect to other disciplines, and then you begin to see this kind of collaboration, which I think is very exciting in the sense that then you begin to see the art object existing not in a vacuum, but actually being in dialogue with the circumstances without being literal. So that I think is a great.
And that reflects back to that in sense of how they engage with audience and their public and their communities. And I think it's much more of a sense of things being joined up little nodes rather than a sense of a really straight obvious kind of line in a sense.
And how does that community come back into your institutions? Because you know, I think sometimes it's so hard for the institution to have that direct relationship, not only to the artist community, but to the community in general. But both of your institutions are very tightly woven with the artists' communities in both of your cities. So how do you, as an institution, you know, particularly Tramway, with the amount of years that you've been in Glasgow, because what's interesting is a lot of artists that you worked with in the early years have come back to do new projects and support younger artists, like we said, with the cross generational dialogue. So how do you as an institution keep connected to that?
I think, I mean, one of the things that works we're playing around really just now with the Tramway is it's a big old space that was originally it housed all the horse-driven trams of Glasgow, and then became a transport museum, and then lay empty for a number of years. But it has these kind of, none of it is purpose-built. If you wanted to build an art centre and a theatre, you wouldn't use the building that we have. But actually, as a result of that, it creates a really interesting, really unique kind of space that can be used in really different ways. And we have two very, very large we have a very, very large visual art space and a large theatre space, and then 2 smaller scale spaces, one of which is a gallery and one of which is more of a theatre space. And one of the things that I'm doing just now, which is why it's a shame Claire's flight didn't come in, is because she's working for me very directly at the moment on linking the theatre and the gallery with one programme. So traditionally the spaces have had their own sort of sense of their own programme on either side of the building, if you like. And so there's been a lot of conversation around cross-practice and how you respond and reflect that. But actually the institutional structure, in a sense, has been about keeping those things actually separate. And one of the things that we are now doing is sort of trying to weave almost like a sort of Tramway live strand that crosses between where people are traditionally thinking of that as a theatre space and this one as a gallery space. Because certainly when I started at Tramway 2 years ago, one of the things, having worked exclusively in a contemporary visual art background and then being responsible for a space that also had a theatre and dance performance programme, was that sense that the audiences were very separate on the 2 sides. So the visual art audience was very distinctly different from the theatre audience, but where we then started to work very quickly with music. And actually the very first project we did was with Phil Collins and his karaoke version of the Smiths' The World Won't Listen album. And it was amazing because that seemed to sort of start pulling people through from a very different sort of engagement with the music. And we went on to develop that with Robin Gristle and Gig and Kerith Wyn Evans. And now what we're trying to do that is with the much younger generation of artists. And so a lot of the guys we're showing for the Oceanfront Nights have artists that we've worked with over the last year on that. But it's interesting because institutions themselves can become stuck in how they respond to those scenes.
Yeah, I think you know, we have a similar situation. Our building is a former car dealership from the 1920s, which includes the showroom, but also the service area. So it's a semi-industrial building that is incredibly beautiful and interesting, but also very unthreatening. And I think it has a kind of availability that art spaces, contemporary art spaces, are losing. And I think people, you know, the building allows them to come in in terms of how I see the program, I think the way that I run the museum is a very kind of democratic way. I'm really interested in kind of exploring or resisting, if you want, the institutionalization of the space, because I think that that's what allows us to be able to do what we do well, in a sense of being able to make those connections with the public programs. We now started to ask our artists who are showing also to help us put the programs together, and they have interest in other things that are, you know, besides their art, and see more intangible connections that, you know, we would never be able to put together. So so the idea is to be able to create an experience, and also not doing it, you know, usually when you are in places that are perceived to be periphery, there's a sense that perhaps you cannot do a challenging program because it's going to alienate people. And I think that one of the things that I'm committed to curatorially is also to do the kinds of exhibitions that are really challenging. And I think that people respond incredibly well if they feel that you're offering them something you know, without pretense, with a kind of openness as discovery. And I think that, and somehow also that that institutions, we've lost the idea that art is elusive and that it's a very difficult process to you know, to capture it. And I think that the idea of failure and the process of walking through the space and maybe perhaps not getting it, but receiving it in a way that's showing it to you in all its glory, or just being there allows people to be able to receive it in a better way. And I when I came to MoCA 2 years ago too, one of the things that was clear to me was that the museum plays a role in the community that is beyond the museum role. So we're incredibly connected to our neighborhood. We're incredibly connected to issues that are germane to the city. I'm very committed to dealing with some of the hard topics also. You know, that we had urban farming panel, which is a hot topic as much as it's an idealized one. Just to be able to make people feel that this is a space where conversation can happen, and where learning can happen in a very natural way.
Yeah, we were saying today that what's great about the two cities is the repurposing of these old buildings kind of breaks down, like you were saying, this kind of division between art center versus, public space in a way, and that, as the kind of lines between art practice get blurred or break down, that also those kind of structures of architecture do as well.
Yeah, also, I think it might be the same for you, that these kind of spaces become places where, like, sometimes I feel that our audience is like in a town center. There's this kind of cross-section of people who have different interests, who actually come together and are able to share things. And I think that when people are in that situation, you're drawing from that community spirit to be able to allow people to share the things that they're interested in. And I think that's a great privilege to be able to do it. And
that really affects, and what I've been interested in, and one of the things that was quite interesting about Tramway was it kind of had this almost iconic international reputation in terms of people being aware that it was where Peter Brook did the Mahabharata and all these kind of different contexts, but actually where it's placed in the city is really, really interesting, because it's not in the city centre of Glasgow, it's actually on the south side, which psychologically in a city, bizarrely, is seen as still quite a problem. It's 3 minutes from the central train station and it's one stop away, but because it's the south of the river. But what it had never really developed was a really kind of a proper relationship, in a sense, within its local context and with the local community. And that was therefore, it was kind of one of these places that it was known, but you would get in a taxi and they would still think it was a transport museum, despite the fact it had been an international art centre for 20 years. And what's been really fascinating about, as a public space, re-looking at that responsibility to your sort of the international, but with the local context, has been being able to play and take quite a lot of risks and experimenting with how we work with artists in that environment. And I think one or two of the photographs that are up there are of an event we did with John Cage's Music Circus. And what was really interesting was hundreds of different artists came and gave of their time, and the whole building was completely taken over by these events. But we had one or two pieces that we felt, well, these are the kind of safer projects. And actually the kids that were they went for the hardcore, total experimental, very, very diverse kind of. So it is that sense of there's a whole, once you start having that dialogue with your community, and they're not coming in thinking, I like this type of art form or that, but they start to have a relationship with the space and the artists. The two things start to have a really interesting dynamic off each other.
Yeah, I think we're running out of time. Do we have time for one or two quick questions? Great. So if anybody has any, it goes too fast, these talks. Once you get going, you have to. So does anybody have any questions for Sarah or Luis? I know, we could keep talking. We just need a beer and we just keep going. Well, if we don't have additional questions, I'd just like to thank Sarah and Luis.
Thank you.
And encourage all of you to come out to the Oceanfront. It's really an amazing program this year with some fantastic artists. And I'd also like to thank our partners at Art Basel, Miami Beach, and Mark and Annette. As Creative Time, we were thrilled to come back. And all of our partners in the program at MoCAD and Tramway, Sophia at Museo Tamayo in Mexico City, and Jörg from O32C. They'll be speaking tomorrow, Jörg and Sophia Hernandez and Jörg Koch, with Nato Thompson, my colleague at Creative Time, tomorrow here. So it would be great if you could come back, talk a little bit about Berlin and Mexico City. But thank you very much. Enjoy the fair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.